Alright, good morning everybody, hope you're doing well. Welcome to a We've Read the Documents live stream. I am your host, John Brisson. Today we are going to talk about a case study from The Battle and the Backlash by David Hechler, The Child Sexual Abuse War. This book was written and published in the 80s. It was published in 1988. I read the West Point information from it. Today I'm going to read from a case that is even less known than West Point, called the Fresh Air Fund. Now, I verified that this part is correct to get the beginning history of the Fresh Air Fund from this New York Times article in 1983. In 1877, the Fresh Air Fund was created to allow children living in disadvantaged communities to get away from hot, noisy streets and enjoy free summer experiences in the country. Reverend Willard Parsons, a minister who had just moved from New York to a small rural parish in Sherman, Pennsylvania, asked members of his congregation to provide community vacations as volunteer host families for New York's neediest children. This was the beginning of the Fresh Air Fund. Okay, so it seems like at the beginning, it had good intentions. By 1881, the work of the fund was expanding so rapidly that Reverend Parsons asked and secured support from the New York Tribune. By 1888, the fund was incorporated as the Tribune Fresh Air Fund Society. Today, Fresh Air continues to depend on favorable publicity for the media with assistance from the New York Times. All right. Case study, the Fresh Air Fund. This was a story about an organization that, when confronted with evidence of abuse in its programs, denied it had a problem. It was all too familiar story, but something remarkable happened literally after the ending was written. This organization, that for years tried to ignore reality and shield itself from scrutiny, granted an interview and admitted it had been naive. The interview also revealed for the first time that this charity, which had been locked in an adversarial relationship with lawyers litigating a third successive child abuse lawsuit against it, joined with those same lawyers in forcing the criminal indictment of the alleged abuser in the most recent suit, 4 years after he had made a deal to avoid prosecution. And then it invited the lawyers, whom it credited with quote-unquote raising its consciousness, to participate in the interview and comment on the victory and the troubles that preceded it. And so this quote-unquote familiar story had been transformed into a two-part account that may be unprecedented. It is a story of ignorance exasperated by denial, but finally faced and defeated by the courage it takes to say, quote-unquote, we are wrong. Denial. Sexual abuse of children on Fresh Air Fund vacations? It sounded impossible. It was like saying the Red Cross promotes malaria or CARE causes malnutrition. Yet there was growing evidence, but buttressed by several lawsuits, that children left in the care of this vulnerable charity were in danger of sexual assault. The Fresh Air Fund provides free summer vacations for New York City children who cannot otherwise afford them. Each summer it sends about 9,000 underprivileged children to stay with host families in so-called friendly towns, scattered in more than a dozen states and Canada. Another 2,500 stay at 4 camps in upstate New York. Private and not-for-profit, the fund is one of the New York's oldest and most revered charities. Its directors represent a who's who of New York society, and it's the backing of some of the city's, indeed the country's, most powerful, prestigious companies and individuals, including Con Edison, David Rockefeller, surprise, surprise, that was me, and the New York Times Company, which contributes more than $75,000 a year. All told, donors contribute about $3 million annually, and the charity's net worth is more than $25 million, according to its 1986 tax forms. But the fund's most valuable supporter is undoubtedly the New York Times itself. Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger is chairman of the fund's board of directors, and every year from May through August, the newspaper runs laudatory articles and editorials and free full-page ads extorting readers to contribute to the Fresh Air Fund. Given this kind of support, the charity's reputation has been nearly sacrosanct. Okay, so this seems like this is a operation that runs on the left side of the world order, probably put forth by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bilderberg Group. Here, a lot on this channel, we talk about blackmail rings that are on the right, like the Franklin scandal, for example. But the Finders and the Fresh Air Fund seem like they're more of the left side of the world order running these operations. Of course, they all connect at the top, in my opinion. The Rockefeller would be both sides, funding both sides, as we know that Rockefeller has funded both the Council for National Policy and the Council on Foreign Relations. But the patina had faded, and had begun to look suspiciously like tarnish. Critics said the fund's program was in dire need of revision. It was a system, they said, that relied totally on volunteers and the quote-unquote goodwill of its participants. Although the system may have worked beautifully in 1877, when a Pennsylvania clergyman brought 9 children from New York City slums back with him to the quote-unquote fresh air of his congregation's farms, critics questioned whether the same system would work in today's world. The focus of the criticism was 3 civil lawsuits filed between 1981 and 1984, charging the fund's negligence in its screening and supervision caused children to be abused. All 3 children named in the suits were black. Over 80% of the children that fund services are black or Hispanic. And 2 cases involved white host families. The latest was a $70 million suit filed in the state Supreme Court in Manhattan, alleging that a 10-year-old child was sexually abused and photographed in quote-unquote kiddie porn poses by our host during 2 consecutive Fresh Air Fund quote-unquote vacations in New Hampshire. Why in a lot of these cases, Franklin, with Rusty T. Nelson being the photographer, or James Toward in the Glendale Montessori School case, likely filming child pornography, or the infamous serial killers Fred and Rosemary West, likely filming child pornography. It seems to be a constant theme when you look into these cases. Criminal charges were not filed until December 1986 because the New York Hampshire prosecutor who handled the investigation agreed not to charge the man in return for his guilty plea in the sexual assault of his own granddaughters, who were 5 and 7 years old at the time he attacked them. Man, this guy's scum. He needs to be taken out back to the woodshed. For those offensive, the man served 8 months of a 12-month jail sentence. The remaining time was suspended. There's evidence that the molester, who is now believed to be living in Arizona, has attacked other children as well. Lawyers for both sides said during the interview that the $70 million lawsuit will be settled as soon as the fund resolves technical problems involving insurance. Its carrier from time to time when the abuse is filed for bankruptcy. The other suits have already been settled. In 1985, the fund paid an undisclosed account to settle suit charging that a 10-year-old Brooklyn boy was sexually assaulted by his counselor at a fresh air camp 4 years earlier. The terms could not be learned, and the settlement had not previously been reported in the media because the court file was sealed at the fund's request. The other suit was settled in 1983 when the fund paid $125,000 to an East Harlem girl, who 3 years earlier, when she was 5, was beaten and tormented during her 4-week stay with a Vermont couple. The couple ultimately pled guilty to criminal charges in connections with the beatings. Critics have called the fund a natural target for pedophiles, adults whose sexual orientation is focused exclusively on children, and predicted that further abuse was inevitable until the charity made substantive changes to its programs. The charges seem to be supported by interviews with convicted pedophiles. One man now in prison for the felonious sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy was asked during an interview in a prison visiting room if he knew what the Fresh Air Fund was. He nodded. They're the group that sends kids from New York away for the summer. Would he be surprised to learn that a pedophile had obtained from the Fresh Air Fund? I'm not naive, he answered, in a memorable understatement. It must happen in all groups: scouting, camping, and big brothers. The prisoner was undoubtedly right. All these groups are vulnerable. The scandals have swept the country in recent years have made it clear that child abuse can and does occur in virtually all institutions. The fund dependence upon volunteers and its isolation of children from their parents seem to make it particularly vulnerable to penetration by pedophiles. Now, I disagree with David here. I think it's the top down, not just a few bad apples got in. Not to say that every family that took care of, allowed the children to come in their house in the Fresh Air Fund by any means were pedophiles or part of this nexus. But I'm pretty sure with funders like David Rockefeller and the New York Times, pretty sure this was a world order ring that was running. Maybe not from the beginning, but it was definitely co-opted later. But what was most troubling was the charity's initial response to the problem. Yeah, of course. Many child care agencies similarly struck were shut down, at least temporarily. But the Fresh Air Fund did not even slow down, much less shut down. No, it's still going today. We're going to talk about that. It was not inclined to discuss the matter with critics or press. Ultimately, it managed to shield itself from inquiry. The charity backed by the New York Times, whose landmark victory in the Supreme Court case Times v. Sullivan made it a First Amendment's greatest champion, obtained a gag order prohibiting the lawyers litigating the third lawsuit from speaking to the press. New York Slimes. The gag order, it should be noted, would aimed at the adverse publicity, in no way stemming the flow of praise in New York Times. Following the appeal, the gag order was affirmed in 1985 by New York County's appellate court. Although the court issued no opinion, sorry, bless me. Although the court issued no opinion explaining its decision, to heap irony upon irony, the preceding judge of the court had argued with passion and eloquence precisely the opposing position several months earlier. In a speech at a child sexual abuse conference at Fordham Law School, a child sexual abuse conference at Jesuit Fordham Law School, a transcript for which appeared in New York Times Law Journal, Justice Francis T. Murphy said, "Children have neither power nor property. Voices other than their own must speak for them. If these voices are silent, then children who have been abused may lean their heads against the window panes and taste the bitter emptiness of violated childhoods." Yeah, Mr. Judge Murphy, Justice Murphy. But then again, you help to cover up the New York Times. Oh, that's irony. That's ironic. He concluded with the exhortation, "Badger every legislator from every country in the state. Let no editor or reporter sleep until the remedy you want is granted. For you are the only voice of the violated child. If you do not speak, there is silence." Well, yeah, and then you silence those voices. Imagine that. Quote-unquote kiddie porn in a quote-unquote friendly town. In an effort to break that silence, an investigation was undertaken with the most recent lawsuit viewed as a case study. Fund executives at the time repeatedly refused requests for interviews and instructed fund volunteers in New Hampshire as elsewhere not to talk to the author. Some of the details, therefore, remain sketchy, but for the following account emerged from dozens of interviews, including many with fund volunteers, who, although still strong supporters of the charity, were sufficiently concerned about the child abuse cases to grant interviews despite the fund's admonition. It's very interesting. This case contains the stuff that Lee Veltman's discussing. It's around the same nexus as the troubled teen industry, being an outdoor fresh camp. And there are elements of, the more, the people who go with the witch hunt narrative, more outlandish cases, like Franklin, or Epstein, or McMartin, or Glendale. It's got a combination of kind of both. And I'm curious to see what the witch hunt narrative people, if they're going to frame this stream as being part of that narrative, that nothing happened here because powerful people were at play with the Fresh Air Fund. Or, because this is very similar to Lee Veltman's work. It's around that nexus, in my opinion. Maybe Lee might disagree. That, there is very much truth to this. Quote-unquote Patricia Doe sent her daughter, quote-unquote Jane, on Fresh Air Fund trips in 1981 and 1982. Jane had just turned 10 and was away from home for the first time when she arrived in the quote-unquote friendly town of Pittsfield, New Hampshire, to spend 2 weeks in the home of Don and LaDonna Tynan, who were 49 and 46 old respectively that first summer. Also played with the Tynans was a young boy named Pedro. If the other Fresh Air Fund children had seen the Tynan's house, they might have been envious. Don Tynan was a commercial airline pilot who made about $80,000 a year, and he and his wife lived in one of the area's largest and most luxurious homes. How so? He was making $80,000 a year back in 1980. I mean, yeah, it's a substantial amount of change, but why such a luxurious home on an airline pilot's salary? Built in 1773, the 11-room, 7-fireplace ranch house offers a panoramic view of the mountains overlooking Pittsfield. Where did he get all the money to buy that, I wonder? And among the Tynans' extensive additions to the property were a stone wall, intercoms, wow, mid-80s, and a mastered bedroom suite complete with spiral staircase and a jacuzzi. Again, I wonder where they got the money for all that. I mean, he's making an airline pilot salary at $80,000 a year. The airline pilots don't have the money to have this much of a luxurious home. Postcards featuring color photograph of their house are still sold in a downtown drugstore. But the other children's envy would have been short-lived. According to Jane's therapist and her mother, the child is still suffering the effects of what happened to her in that beautiful house, although she had made considerable progress in therapy. That's good. As the child's mother and therapist tell it, the abuse started with baths in the jacuzzi. Tynan would bathe the girl and then play games like quote-unquote hide-and-seek. Later, Tynan began exposing himself and eventually got in the jacuzzi with her. Tynan's former daughter-in-law, the mother of the grandchildren he sexually abused, said in an interview that the sexual contact with her daughters was also begun in the jacuzzi. Oh, man, this guy's sick. Her name and those of her children have not been published in order to protect their privacy. That's it's important to protect your sources, David. Such use of play and games is a common way pedophiles initiate sexual contact. According to Flora Kahlo, Jane's therapist and a specialist in treating children who are assault victims, Jane told Kahlo that after a week, Tynan's wife discovered what was going on and, following a loud argument, insisted her husband leave home and not return until Jane was gone. Oh, well, she's guilty. She's guilty too. The former Miss Tynan, now remarried, admitted she asked her husband to leave the house. She denied, however, that had anything to do with sexual abuse. She also denied that her ex-husband ever abused her granddaughters, despite his guilty plea. Oh, yeah, this is definitely... Likely she knew. I'm not going to say she participated, but it's highly likely she knew and didn't want to self-incriminate herself. You can't testify against your spouse, but still. Interviewed in her own Ohio home in May 1985, Johnny Tynan Bates said she asked her husband to leave because they were having problems. That predated Jane's visit. When asked what those problems were, she said, quote-unquote, that's personal. Asked whether her husband ever photographed naked children, she said herself had photographed him with children in the jacuzzi. Don had a swimsuit on, and most kids take baths naked. Why are you going to photograph other people's children taking baths? I'm just saying, these are people that are in your care, and you're photographing them taking baths? Okay. She said as she scanned a bookshelf from a photo album, one of 40 she has from those days. She said, in finding it, flipped through about 20 pages of Polaroid photographs. In some of the photographs, children, including Jane, were in the jacuzzi alone. In others, Tynan was with them, arms around the children and smiling broadly. It was impossible to tell whether Tynan was wearing a bathing suit. The children wore bathing suits in some pictures, but in most they were naked. Why were the children naked with this man in a jacuzzi if nothing was going on? Nothing. Several photographs showed Tynan with the granddaughters he sexually abused. There were no pictures of Pedro among those shown, and it is not known whether he was involved in any abuse. During the second week of her stay, Jane had no direct contact with Tynan, although he called to apologize, according to therapist Kahlo. The apology, Kahlo said, was one of the reasons the child returned next summer. Wow. Jane believed Tynan was sorry for what he had done, and she was reassured by cards and letters he sent her during the year. Yeah, that is grooming. That is grooming and obsessive and sickening. And she believed that she would count on Miss Tynan to intervene if there were trouble again. But the most important reason Jane returned, Colo believes, is that she was emotionally incapable of disclosing the abuse, and because she would give no reason not to return, she felt she had to go. Yeah, for all those Harvey Weinstein apologizers out there that are like, why would a woman who was raped by Weinstein sleep with him again? Yeah, there is a form of abusive Stockholm syndrome that goes around, and just because someone abuses you doesn't mean that you won't ever, sleep with them if you're above age, or be molested by them again if you're underage. It's a control power. It's a power factor. And it happened to this poor girl again because she felt like she had no choice. It's disgusting. It's sick. Poor girl. But it was a different household to which Jane returned to a July 22nd, 1982. There was no Miss Tynan to protect her. Johnny said she left her husband for good in May, more than 2 months before Jane's arrival, returning to the house one last time on July 2nd to pick up her car and clothes before driving to Ohio. Tynan was coping with the summer, not only with her recent separation, but also with severe financial difficulties that had led to the foreclosure on his house a year later. Huh. Why? Was he getting found out? Was he getting found out? Yeah, Jane was left alone in her care. Pedro did not return. Tynan is alleged to have reportedly abused his child, his 2 granddaughters, and others during Jane's 2-week stay. He allegedly showed the children pornographic pictures and then had them take turns using his Polaroid camera to photograph each other in similar poses with him. Jane was penetrated vaginally, anally, and orally with fingers and foreign objects, including a vibrator, according to Colo. Tynan told Jane he was teaching her about sex, or her mother wouldn't have to teach her. Patricia said, "Oh man, this guy. How many years did he get in prison? Was he? Did he get the chair? Probably not. It's New York." It was more than a year after the abuse ended before Jane was able to disclose it. Tynan told her he would go to jail and said she would go to home for bad girls if she ever told. Patricia said. Colo added that Jane was guilt-ridden and didn't know how to begin to tell her mother. Threats and psychological manipulation, she said, are common means by which abusers keep victims quiet, and most experts in the field say that many, perhaps most, abused children never tell, and those who do often keep the abuse secret for a long time. That's true. They're too scared to, and they feel ashamed. Silence followed by silence. Critics of the fund have said they believe many children do not disclose abuse. The number of victimized on the fund's vacations will never be publicized. The investigation reveals several such examples. Before the gag order was imposed in the $70 million lawsuit and before the fund's attitude changed, attorneys Melvin Boraka and Andrew Vox have represented the plaintiffs in all 3 suits, were predictably the fund's most vocal critics. Vax is 44 years old and is nationally recognized expert on child abuse. He has lectured across the country in groups ranging from social workers to judges. His frequent guests on radio and television programs has written articles and books on the subject. His 2 critically acclaimed detective novels both deal with child abuse. As far as he knows, he's the only private lawyer in the country whose practice is limited to the representation of children. He is not, however, a specialist in civil litigation, so before the first suit was filed, he'd been searching for a lawyer who would take on the case. Fraught with uncertainty and almost immensely powerful and popular adversary that had never been before successfully sued. Add the fact that lawyers engaged in civil litigation are commonly paid a third of what verdict a court hands down, but nothing if they lose, and it's not hard to understand the response. Following a long search for a lawyer willing to take a chance, as Vox put it, he found Melvin Boraka, 42, who specialized in personal injury cases and was intrigued by the challenge. Interested in the cause and convinced that there might be substantial money if they won. Vox and Baraka had argued that because parents of Fresh Air Fund are often disadvantaged members of minority groups who may not trust in the enforcement of their legal rights, often for good reason, and because the fund services are free, the parents are far less likely to complain, formally or informally, than are, say, middle-class white clients who pay for a service. Even though willing to complain, they said, might not fully understand their rights and may be discouraged by lack of results. They cited Patricia as a prime example. Patricia says she contacted the New York City police with the intention of pressing criminal charges soon after she had learned of the abuse. In October 1983, they told her the complaint had to be filed in New Hampshire, where the crime allegedly occurred. When she contacted the police in New Hampshire, they told her to check the dates of the trip and have Jane's therapist interview her in order to provide evidence that the abuse had occurred. Patricia mailed them the information, including a transcript for the interview, but never heard back. To this day, she's never heard back from Merrimack County Prosecutor Michael Johnson, who took over the case. Interviewed in his Concord office in October 1984, Johnson said that an interview was ongoing. But during a follow-up interview there the following April, Johnson changed his story. When confronted with information obtained from David Mancini, the chief of the Bennington, New Hampshire Police Department, but formerly the Pittsfield police officer who investigated the Tynan case, Johnson admitted he had made a deal with Tynan's attorney. He had agreed, he said, not to prosecute Tynan again unless he was shown evidence that he had been a greater degree of that's a weird turn of phrase. Been a greater degree of penetration in Jane's case than in the case involving Tynan's granddaughters, asking they would not reopen the case until he was presented with that evidence. In a separate interview that month, New Hampshire Attorney General questioned the propriety of Johnson's decision. As for the $70 million lawsuit, Patricia did not realize at first that she could sue the Fresh Air Fund. When she first called the fund's Manhattan office in November 1983 to inform of the abuse, she had spoken with Associate Executive Director Tom Carger, an assistant director of camping, who was eager to meet with her. When they met, Carger told her he'd never heard of abuse on the Fresh Air Fund trip, and that the fund would be happy to help in any way it could. Patricia said she had never heard from him again. Patricia was bitter at the way she and Jane were treated by the New Hampshire authorities, and particularly by the Fresh Air Fund. Of the fund, she said, they quote-unquote, they lied, they don't care. If Carger knew they had cases in the past, I think he at least had called and said, how are things going with your daughter? If they care about children, they should help you after something goes wrong. Yeah, at the very least. At a recent interview, Carter explained that he'd been chosen to meet with Patricia because he had a master's degree in social work and was viewed as the best to handle the situation. He says his intention was to learn the name of the alleged abuser so the fund could avoid sending him another child. Oh, yeah, to cover your tracks. To find out whether the proper authorities had been contacted and offer assistance to the family. When Patricia said that she had been in touch with the New York police and had been told to contact the police in New Hampshire, what she intended to do, it sounded to Carger as if necessary steps had been taken. As for his remark about the child abuse, Carger remembers saying that he never heard of a case like it in the Fresh Air Fund, referring to sexual abuse in a friendly town, of which there are no reported cases. Patricia's question of why no one called to find out how Jane was doing, Carger said it's a good question. Since the fund had changed the way it's responded to cases of abuse, he said. Why? And the fund's lawyer was also present during the interview. Added that the decision not to contact the family again was not made by Carger, but a group of the fund officials. Although the fund refused to comment on Patricia's criticism at the time, she made comments citing the pending lawsuit before the gag order was in place, and had always been so reticent. In response to the first lawsuit, fund spokesmen said initially that the child may have been abused, but the own mother was the perpetrator. Always with these witch hunt narratives. I'm not saying that abuse doesn't happen within families. Most of the time, that's the number one, where the abuse occurs is within families, within people especially within the immediate family. But, it's always going back to blaming, the parents, that no one else is ever at fault. You see that a lot with the witch hunt narrative, especially in McMartin Preschool case. And it's the same here, that her mother was the one. Man, that's messed up. The fund, they added, was merely a travel agent and was not responsible for the children it transported. Oh, yeah, of course. Finally, after the abusers pled guilty to criminal charges, the fund paid to settle the lawsuit. The charity issued a brief public statement. The Fresh Air Fund deeply regrets this incident. It would be a pity if this isolated incident were to be taken out of the perspective, potentially limiting the success of our drive and therefore the number of children we can help this summer. Gotta get that money. Gotta keep that money rolling in them donations. Despite the reference to a quote-unquote isolated incident, There are indications that the fund began to recognize systemic problems as early as 1985. A Times article said committee members interview prospective hosts at their homes and ask whether the family has pets, where the children will sleep, and how the families discipline their own children. The fund does not permit corporal punishment. Those families who wish to continue participating in the program are re-interviewed every 3 years. Emphasis added. Yeah, are they? These policies were different from the stated in 1982 Friendly Town Chairman's Manual, obtained from a source which is primarily a body of information able to fund volunteers. Although on the surface the policy suggested increased vigilance, critics said they did not go nearly far enough. Moreover, they said, the fund had no way of knowing whether they were even implemented. No system is perfect, they said, but the funds place children at risk unnecessarily with the distinct possibility, if not likelihood, that the majority of cases the fund would never even learn of the damage that was done. Patricia registered Jane at one of the 40 community centers and agencies around New York City that process applications for the Fresh Air Fund. The fund made no attempt to screen the children. It merely required an application and a doctor's examination before busing them in shifts to and from the 320 friendly towns. The shuttles began in July and continued through August. On the other hand, volunteer committees, usually composed of long-term friendly town hosts, were responsible for recruiting and screening host families. Committees were usually small, and often the chairperson did the vast majority of the work, which theoretically included advertising in newspapers and on radio, processing host applications, checking references, and interviewing new hosts. Neither committee members nor hosts were compensated for work or reimbursed for expenses, and many held additional full-time jobs. According to several former chairpersons, the only training provided for the position was the chairman's manual, an optional one-day workshop offered in at least some locations, given by a local representative and an executive from the Manhattan office. As far as could be learned, none of the volunteers or those who instructed them had professional training in child placement or protection. Although the Fresh Air Fund said the interviews and home visits were required prior to placement, critics have asserted that the fund had no way of knowing whether this policy was followed. No interview forms were sent to the central office, for example. Volunteers were required only to send in forms listing the names and address of hosts, their hobbies, and their sex, age, and number of children requested. There's evidence, moreover, the hosts who received children without having been interviewed at all. The court record of an unsuccessful 1978 lawsuit charging the fund was responsible for a child's illness contained the plaintiff's account of how the child was placed. No one came to her, the host's house. No one investigated anything. One phone call, no interview, no application. You want to take the two children from New York City? Yes, all right, and that's about it. Nor did the fund's attorney dispute the account. There was a telephone conversation with the chairlady from that particular area who spoke with the host on the telephone and arranged with her and found out where she lived and found out who she was and how many people in her family. Basically told her right there on the phone, to be a host, you have to treat the kids from New York like your own, and she was a chairlady, was convinced that the woman was the kind of host that she would recommend to the Fresh Air Fund. And she did. When a personal interview was conducted, there was no uniform procedure that all volunteers followed in making an assessment. Most often they spoke of a quote-unquote gut feeling they get from a visit. In this respect, as in most others, the program in New Hampshire seemed quite similar to programs described by volunteers in Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts. Roger Stone, whose wife Teresa was chairperson of the Concord, New Hampshire committee for 8 years, explained, "We turned a number of people down and we just went by gut instinct. We're not trained psychologists. We're volunteers like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts." Hold on. Whoa. Not Roger Stone's. Could be a common name. I couldn't remember Roger Stone's first wife. No, it's a different Roger Stone. Okay. Whew, I was about to say. Oh boy, that was a biggie. His first wife's name was Anne. Alright. Similarly, Audrey Ordway, who had worked on the Concord Committee, recalled turning down a widower who wanted a 12-year-old boy. He wanted to know exactly what he was getting, she said. It didn't hit me right. Sometimes you just have the intuition. I mean, yeah. Representatives did not always agree on what was permitted and what was not. Asked how marital status would affect replacement of a child, Ordway said, "I wouldn't place a little girl with a widower, but someone else might. But a divorced man with children, of his own, I wouldn't hesitate." As for spanking, Ordway said, she told hosts, "Do what you do to your own." I thought they weren't allowing corporal punishment. Teresa Stone, however, had a different view. "Unless there is no problem getting the same kid back," she said. "But if the hosts have gotten divorced or something, that's a whole different story. Of spanking," she said, "I would tell people you can't hit these kids. To some, a spanking is a slap on the leg. To others, it's hitting hard." On the two policies, however, there seemed to be anonymity. First, volunteers felt that in order to turn down a host, they had to have good reason. Said Stone of one placement, "We gave him a child. We didn't have any reason to turn him down," Ordway echoed. "We can't refuse anybody that's on the up and up." Second host that did not have to be interviewed if they invited a child is Susan Picard, former chairperson of Rochester, New Hampshire committee. Hosts don't have to do another thing except they say they want their children back. Beyond such screening, when it is done, there was no supervision during a child's visit or a follow-up after a child left. Often a child's only contact with fund volunteers on the day of arrival and the day of departure. The reason they did not visit to see how the children was doing is you never had enough time to visit all the homes, said Stone. When there were no interviews with the children or the host of the children left to determine how the program worked. What the pros say. Professionals in the child placement and protection interview for this chapter were sharply critical of the Fresh Air Fund's methods. "I don't think you can any longer just have neighbors looking at neighbors saying, 'They seem nice enough and they want to take a kid,'" said Susan Sabor, a director of the professional issues at the New York State Council of Voluntary Family and Child Care Agencies, which she said is responsible for placing 90% of New York's children currently in child care. "They may have worked a number of years ago," she continued. "Empirically, it doesn't seem to be working now." Oh, that may have worked a number of years ago, she continued. "Empirically, it doesn't seem to be working now. I think we have to look at our social services systems, including places like the Fresh Air Fund, giving a whole new set of social variables," she added. Bennington Police Chief David Mancini said he thought the fund's view of New Hampshire was naive. "We raise cows, go fishing, and watch the sunset. I think people in urban areas think that's the way it is out here in the woods," he said. "It isn't that way at all. If you could work it out on paper, you probably find the sexual abuse occurs as frequently here as it does in the city. The only difference is that there are smaller communities where it's kept quiet. Ignorance of such matters endangers children," said Don Robin, the New Hampshire social worker who investigated the reports of abuse lodged against Tynan. "A pedophile is going to seek out children as a means of sexual gratification. It's only logical they're going to go to other sources of children. Those," he said, "are jobs at daycare centers, YMCAs, summer camps, and similar organizations." "But such jobs increasingly require a thorough background check," Raybun said. "To obtain a child from the Fresh Air Fund, however, is far easier and there's presumably less risk of being caught than there is when the pedophile and his victim live in the same community. To minimize the danger to children," Raybun suggested, "the host families be treated as foster homes. Instead of looking at them as host homes, the Fresh Air Fund should look at them as short-term foster homes and have them licensed and go through the process. It's more expensive, it's more of a nuisance, but the probability of the children getting hurt is lessened, probably considerably." I'm not so sure about that. All of the interviewed spoke of the difficult. It does lessen it, though. You get some oversight, or even complete oversight, is better than nothing. All of those interviewed spoke of the difficulty of child placement and the impossibility of ever being absolutely certain a child is safe, and the need for professional training to minimize the inherent dangers. Mary Misio, executive director of the Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Manchester, New Hampshire, said professional training was essential in child placement, that an organization that did not provide adequate training would be negligent. The director of New Hampshire's Division of Child and Youth Services, David Bundy, called such training crucial, necessary at a minimum. There are general agreements that at a minimum that the Fresh Air Fund should hire professionals in each geographic region to train volunteers and supervise their work. You have to have a background to investigate, Chief Mancini said. The perfect background would be an investigator trained in youth services or someone experienced in child abuse cases. Someone like Dan Rayburn, he added, would be ideal. If the fund hired one such investigator supervisor for each case, that person could train the volunteers and critique them, Mancini said. The volunteers should also be given forms to fill out, and assessing applicants in these, he said, should be reviewed by the supervisors. Hiring professionals would also provide an accountability that could help enforce performance standards. If you get someone who is hired and trained at his job is at stake, said Mancini, he's going to do a hell of a lot better than an untrained volunteer. Macicio added, if I make a lot of bad decisions, I don't have a job anymore. Where with a volunteer, that wouldn't be the case. Along with criticism of the training or lack of training of doing the placing, there was also criticism of the fund's placement methods. All spoke of the need for thorough screening, supervision, and follow-up, and suggested procedures by which they could be accomplished. If you want to absolutely guarantee as best you can the children are going to be safe, said Bundy, you should have upfront interviews with hosts, police checks, record checks, reference checks, doing unannounced visits while the kids are there, and exit visits with them after the children leave, and periodic updates and interviews with the host. Yeah, that's definitely better than nothing. Said Mancini, I don't think it would be complicated to investigate once you set the criteria, he suggested. The best method for doing so would be hire professional consultants. It would take several trained investigators a couple of weeks to set it up, he said. Then you have some pretty good criteria. In addition to the case-by-case review, regular evaluation of the entire program was also suggested. Sabor suggests assessments to identify and remedy programs in specific regions, as well as general reviews of the program. A general evaluation would consider such questions as, would the program be better if fewer children were involved? Are the families generally adequate? What could improvements be made? These are the other questions ought to be raised regularly. Sabor said, and are particularly important when an organization learns of abuse within its program. I would like to see the Fresh Air Fund socially responsible, she said, and I like them to be available to the abused kid and the family. I think the Fresh Air Fund would at least be willing to look at the case honestly. Was there something we could have done to prevent this? What it could have known and what it could have known when it could have known it. Is it possible to say when the fund actually knew about the Tynans? It is certain they're responsible for screening them, but it's likely it was Janine Walton. Patricia said she was told by a secretary of the fund's Manhattan office that her daughter was assigned to the Northwood Committee, which is closest to the Tynas home in Pittsfield. The committee chair in 1981 and 1982 was Walton, according to Susan Picard, who chaired the nearby Rochester community those years and who worked closely with her. Walton declined to be interviewed, speaking through the screen door of a residence in East Rochester. She said, I've been told not to talk to you. She would not say who gave her those instructions. Asked if she placed children in Pittsfield, as Picard said. She replied, no comment. When Johnny Tynan Bates, who asked who, if anyone, interviewed her in 1981, she said she cannot remember the woman's name, only that someone from the fund had come to her house. Unless the case comes to trial, which seems unlikely given the assertion by lawyers for both sides, then it will be settled. The full story may never be known. But there's a wealth of information the fund could have learned about the Tynans. The most obvious and important was that Tynan's wife had left him before Jane arrived in 1982. Should the fund have known this in a town of about 3,000? Mancini said it should. He knew Johnny had left, he said, referring to whoever allowed Jane to return after Johnny was gone. Mancini said someone should have that person by the short hairs. Aside from the possible instability of a man whose wife had just left him and the questionable advisability of placing a girl with a single man, there was another factor to consider. Tynan's job as an airline pilot frequently took him out of town. During Jane's visit, he was gone for several days, according to his former daughter-in-law. She remembered, she said, because Tynan left Jane with her in violation of fund rules. The information available in 1981 was less usual and more difficult to obtain. But there was a good deal a trained investigator or someone consulting with one could have learned. The local police are always a good reference, said social worker Ray Bunn, who suggested that police be required as one of the 3 reference hosts are asked to supply. The police are a particularly valuable source in rural areas, where they are likely to know everyone personally. Ray Bunn added, they would seem to apply to virtually all friendly towns. Mancini said he would be happy to discuss the Tynans and other prospective hosts from Pittsfield with fund representatives. What could he have told them? That the Tynans were having financial problems? That Miss Tynan had written bad checks? And at least one of her 6 children had been in trouble? Anyone who knew would be expected to know they were having money problems, Mancini said. In fact, the Tynans were heavily in debt. So heavily that in September 1981 they filed a Chapter 7 petition with the United States Bankruptcy Court in Manchester, and 2 years later their house was foreclosed on. According to the claim filed with the court, they even owed $3,107 in child support payments to their own daughter, who stayed in California when the family moved east. The youngest of the 5 Tynan boys was in trouble with the law, Mancini said, for persistently driving without a license and registration, until he was finally jailed. He just wouldn't quit, said Mancini, who called the boy flaky. Mancini described another son as screwed up. Given the information, even a highly trained investigator probably could not have predicted what Tynan would... Given this information, even a highly trained investigator probably could not have predicted what Tynan would do to Jane. But a prediction is not required in placing a child. Writing bad checks and raising children who get into trouble indicate an attitude, according to Mancini. That's basically what you're working on is an attitude, he said. That's all you're going to get. In this case, you don't have to prove anything, he said. You can just pass on a host family. In theory, that is true. The Fresh Air Fund is not required to explain a rejection, as a social agency turning down a foster home must do under New York law, for example. But fund volunteers said they felt obliged to place a child in a home when there was good reason not to. Unless there was a good reason not to. Was there a good reason not to place the Fresh Air Fund children with the Tynans? A fund representative apparently decided not. But had the representative asked Mancini the same question in 1981 or 1982, he would have answered yes. 2020 hindsight, foresight. There are those who say that Mancini spoke with 2020 hindsight. What is the use, they will ask, of dredging up the past? But for Jane, the past is not over. According to her therapist, while her peers are talking about dating, Jane is terrified of having a relationship with a male. She still has occasional nightmares. Until quite recently, she has trouble concentrating on schoolwork. She was irritable and often picked fights with her siblings, and she asked questions her mother could not answer. Questions like, why wasn't Don Tynan been punished? Since the indictment, the question that has troubled her is, why did God let this happen to me? Jane has been receiving therapy thanks to the efforts of mothers and lawyers. Most experts agree that early intervention and treatment offer abuse victims the best chance of recovery. Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Manchester refers children for professional counseling, if needed, even when the relationship is severed amicably, according to Macio. If a case of child abuse occurred, Macio said, the child will be referred for counseling, and the agency would report the incident to the local social services department and would aid them in any way possible. The Fresh Air Fund, by comparison, has not showed a willingness to provide children with therapy or to report abuse in the first 2 cases, although it said it would in the third had Patricia not already done so. There were those who said a strong dose of hindsight was precisely what the fund needed. If the fund did not take a hard look at its past, further cases of abuse were inevitable. They said even its supporters saw a need for improvement. The program is a good program, said former chairperson Susan Picard. All these kids wouldn't have a way of getting out of the city and seeing how other people live and what their options are, nor would people here have the option of finding out that these kids that they almost think of ghetto kids or zombie kids are kids that they can love. But I could definitely see restrictions needed to be tightened up, she said. With the fund screening method, she said, it's a loose arrangement. No 2 ways about that. I think that now you're running into a problem of a lot of women working, which 10 years ago they didn't so much, Picard said. And so you're having people do this on a part-time basis because they try to be real nice and they believe in the program. But let's face it, if you're already working 40 to 50 hours a week, and if you have any size to your program, we put through 90 kids, that would be a tough part-time. Picard agrees with suggestions that the program should be improved if the police and social services provide information for background checks and training for volunteers. You need some kind of training, she said, and you certainly need some kind of review system. Although with other professionals interviewed, Chief Mancini foresaw difficult but necessary decisions in the fund's future. Speaking from behind his desk at the Bennington Police Station, located in a cramped basement beneath City Hall, he said people don't like getting investigated. They get belligerent. They're going to lose a lot of volunteers and hosts if you go that method. But you gotta do something. The problem is not going to go away. Doing nothing, he added, is like saying you don't need juvenile officer because sooner or later the juveniles are going to be adults. Yeah, Chief Mancini seems like he's a decent cop. The change. Okay, so part 2, redemption. The change began during the settlement of the second lawsuit, according to C. Stephen Hurd, Jr., a lawyer and officer of the fund's board of directors. During a 3.5 interview in Hurd's Manhattan office, he and fund counsel Robert Gaynor spoke for the charity, while Vax and Baraka provided their own perspectives. What Hurd and Gaynor discovered during their settlement was that the opposing lawyers were neither lunatics nor mercenaries, two possibilities that occurred to them before they met face to face. The first meeting was July 1985. The fund's lawyers were surprised to find that it was not money that seemed to drive Vox and Baraka, nor did they seem unreasonable. Hurd recalled a question Vox posed as a kind of a turning point. How would you view it if it happened to one of your own children? I didn't have to think very long, Hurd remembered. I killed a son of a bitch, he said. For all those people about the witch hunt narratives that say, Raymond Bucky didn't do nothing wrong, it was testified in court by both one of the women, I forgot her name, that had a child at McMartin Preschool, and by Peggy Bucky, Raymond Bucky's mother, that he would wear shorts and have children on his lap in the school classroom while reading Playboys. Does that seem like normal behavior? If you have a child, would you let that happen? A strange man? Or some people can argue even the teacher that they know and not a strange man, but, it's not like a family member. I don't say a family member should, I'm just saying as far as people saying that Bucky's not a strange man, okay? He's a teacher. Would you let a strange man sit, have your child sit on his lap while he's wearing shorts, reading Playboy magazines, while his mother, when she comes in the classroom and sees it when it happens on occasion, visibly looking at her son's penis in the shorts to check to see if he is aroused? No. I would have pulled my kid from the school. It is crucial to abused child's recovery that she be told whatever happened was neither her fault nor a figment of her imagination, Vox explained to them. The clearest and strongest way the message could be communicated, he said, and I would also, turn Ray Bucky over to local police if I had it with Perry McMartin, is by telling her that society has punished the person responsible when it has. If you're prepared to change your position and see this is for what it is, let's work together to see that Tynan is indicted, Fox challenged. The fund's attitude had already begun to change by this time, according to Gaynor, who pointed to the difference between the charity's response to the first suit and the third. In the first case, remember, the fund denied any responsibility and even accused the mother of having abused the child. Hurd said the disaster of the first case led to the changes in the lawyers brought up in Gaynor. Yeah, of course. In the Doe case, there was an immediately acceptance of the situation as Patricia related it, and expressed willingness to help. The charity had come a long way, Gaynor said, but it was not there yet, and they knew it, and they would have decided to accept Fox's challenge. It was extraordinary for a number of reasons. It is rare that adversaries unite, especially in the middle of an emotionally charged lawsuit. They united in order to do what all agreed was truly in the best interest of the child. Oh, dear Lord, think of the children. That's what it reminds me of. Although the New Hampshire prosecutor has strongly questioned those motives. It was also in what they agreed was the best interest of the fund, and that literally millions of children it would serve in the future. Prosecution would send a message not only to Jane, but to the Tynans out there who contemplating molested or otherwise maltreating Fresh Air Fund children. That's right. You don't do such a things. The message he wants them to hear, Hurd said, is that people who abuse in any way children in the Fresh Air Fund are going to be pursued by the fund and its board and its lawyers to the full extent of the law. And there's any misconception in anyone's mind that they're going to look the other way because it's easier and more convenient, they should look at the history of Mr. Tynan in New Hampshire. They're going to be very sadly mistaken. The final pages of the history have not yet been written, but it has been a remarkable story so far. It's also stirred up strong, bitter feelings in at least one New Hampshire resident. Back to New Hampshire. Michael Johnson was a brick wall, Gaynor said during the interview, but the New Hampshire prosecutor did not appear to be a wall at first, or at least not an unsurmountable one. Gaynor added Vox had already asked Johnson to indict Timon on criminal charges. He was convinced Johnson never would and was ready to implement another strategy, but the fund's lawyers thought they might persuade him if they took the lead. Oh, imagine that. In August 1984, Gaynor and Hurd flew to Concord and met with Johnson to insist he reopen the case. Johnson's response was, "Don't call us, we'll call you," Gaynor said. But Gaynor did call, repeatedly. Johnson was no longer talking about a greater degree of penetration, he said. There had to be a greater degree of culpability. Oh, this Johnson's a cover-up artist. They were talking of sending the investigator down to New York to interview the child and her therapist. It didn't happen. Finally, a videotape interview of the child was suggested. Gaynor said he was led to believe that he just had a videotape that met Johnson's evidentiary requirements and indictment would be obtained. Fox arranged for the interview to be conducted by an assistant district attorney from a suburb of New York City who had experience in interviewing children in sexual abuse cases. The prosecutor had never met Jane, and the entire session was supervised by FBI agents at their headquarters. Of course! To ensure there was no coaching or other contamination of evidence. Of course. The friendly FBI. Always there to help. Vox said Gaynor flew back to New York. Gaynor flew back to New Hampshire to hand-deliver the tape. When Johnson viewed it, he professed he found it credible, Gaynor said. He just wanted to talk to the assistant district attorney who conducted the interview. It was part of a pattern, according to Gaynor. He was always raising the hurdle on us. After Johnson talked to the ADA, he wanted a sworn statement from Patricia expressing her wish to see Tynan prosecuted, along with the opinion from Jane's therapist that prosecution would not harm the child. They were delivered, both stated the child needed and wanted Tynan to be punished, but still no indictment. In their last phone conversation, Johnson told Gaynor, "I'm not going to tell you what the status of the case is. Don't call me anymore." Gaynor described the entire effort as a year and a half of frustration. Yeah, Johnson's a crooked cop. He knows something. I wonder if something was going on back in New Hampshire in that town. Something widespread. Widespread that was going on during the 1980s and the 1990s, what they call the witch hunt narrative, which is still going on today, just that we don't hear about it. Vox was more scathing in his criticism. "To me, the real horror is Michael Johnson knew that our child was molested, knew that other children had been molested, knew our child was a Fresh Air child, and never notified the Fresh Air Fund that a person to whom they were entrusting children had been convicted of sexual crimes against other children." When the criticism was laid to him during an interview, Johnson said he would not comment on the merits of the pending case, but he did respond to the accusations. He did not take issue with the basic facts Gaynor described, but he objected to the way his behavior was characterized. He began by explaining his view of the prosecutorial discretion. "Fortunately for our liberties," he said, "the criminal justice system and the civil justice system are separate and distinct in regard to determining who gets charged, prosecuted, and punished for crimes. And that is fortunate, I say, because we're a free society. Prosecution in the country takes that freedom away, and that should not be in any way commingled with financial interests, regardless of how sincere those interests might be. Now, I tried to impress that to the Fresh Air Fund." Explaining those interests, he continued, $70 million at interest when there was a question as to whether or not Mr. Timon would be responsible for the financial liability as opposed to the Fresh Air Fund, in my opinion, discounts the kind of input one might get from all civil litigants. And that's why the civil process is not part of the criminal process. While Tynan has been sued in connection with alleged abuse, Johnson was apparently referring to the possibility that he will be, and to the presumed effect a criminal conviction would have on such case, as well as on the lawsuit against the Fresh Air Fund. Yeah, he should be sued. He should be sued. He's a corrupt cop. And to the evidence he deemed necessary to proceed, Johnson responded, "The distinction between the offenses in New York New Hampshire in the criminal code is the question of penetration. The girl was orally and vaginally and anally raped and penetrated by both Mr. Tynan and the use of objects. What is this cop talking about? So I indicated to you that this accusation was a greater criminal culpability, a more egregious offense because of the nature of the penetration, which is a distinction between a misdemeanor Class A and Class B felonies. Oh, so he doesn't want to charge him with a felony? Oh, well. Then when I consider going forward with it, but of course if it is a felony, he's fine, but since it's a misdemeanor, he's not going to charge him. Any jail time is better than none. That was understanding left with Mr. Tynan's initial attorney, referring to the agreement that made a case involving Tynan's granddaughters. Mr. Gaynor was never led to believe that the state prosecution would or would not occur, he continued. It's apparent that Mr. Gaynor says the criminal justice process is sort of a monopoly game. If you get to square 1 to square 10, you get an indictment. That's obviously not the system in this country, thank God. In terms of hurdles that Mr. Gaynor addresses, they are not hurdles. They are responses to Mr. Gaynor's insistence that we indict. The indictment is not the goal, justice is. Is the criminal justice system, not the criminal indictment system. Responding to the charge that Tynan could have obtained another fresh air child, Johnson said that the man had been in jail, followed carefully by supervised probation. How does supervised probation work so well for Jeffrey Epstein? After his conviction, he had after his conviction, I guess it wasn't supervised probation for Jeffrey Epstein. It was supervised house visits where he had to work and then returned to jail. After his conviction, he had record that could be checked, but it's his same preference. Be checked by an organization to consider placing a child with him. There's no way that this individual could be properly considered for any type of child supervision, period, he said. Finally, Johnson questioned the motivation, particularly Andrew Vox, then prompt to effort to seek prosecution. Ask Mr. Vox what his percentage of the $70 million will be and when, if the judgment is rendered, he challenged. In my opinion, continued, Mr. Gaynor and Mr. Vox were using the child and her trauma to attempt to convince this office to prosecute. Yeah, they should have. Therefore, their continuing efforts to make input on the processes were discounted because of what obviously was in the best interest of the child at the time. The child wanted prosecution. The comment from them was that the child needed closure. The child needed to know what the defendant had been punished for, what the child went through. It was clearly explained to them that the man had been punished and that the child could be informed, but not for her. For what it was, he was punished for what he did to his granddaughters. Of what to provide the closure they wished. However, they didn't wish the closure under these circumstances. It certainly was not, in my interpretation, the kind of support that would normally offer to a child victim in this jurisdiction. Keeping a case alive for 3 or 4 years is not the kind of thing that assists a child is getting over trauma and providing the child with closure. Vox responded, if Michael Johnson is saying my motivation arose from the lawsuit, his problem is that prosecutorial duty arose way before there was any concept of a lawsuit, way before this ever came to my attention. Patricia contacted the New Hampshire police in November 1983. Tynan pled guilty to sexual assault the following month, and the lawsuit was filed 10 months later, he observed. For Michael Johnson to say, well, the child should have been contented herself with the fact that Tynan had been prosecuted seems ridiculous to me, when the only way the child found out about the prosecution was due to our investigation, Vox added, that Johnson never contacted the family and never disclosed to him that the agreement had made with Tynan's attorney. For him to talk about what's best interest in the child, Vox continued, when he has exactly contrary information from the child's family, and the child's therapist, is to me indefensible. As far as the percentage we get of any recovery, the percentage is fixed by court. We are limited to a third of the recovery, but that's an outside limitation. A lesser amount can be fixed by the court in an infant's compromise order. Vox had encountered a similar situation before in the case that led to the first lawsuit against the Fresh Air Fund. As a matter of fact, the prosecutor never brought criminal charges. He said he needed more evidence. Vox went public. The press reported their heated exchanges, not dissimilar to those above. And ultimately, Vox turned to the Vermont Attorney General, who took over the case and successfully prosecuted. Vox believed it was a legitimate and effective way to force prosecution in a case where there was sufficient evidence to proceed, where a prosecutor refused to do so without presenting legitimate reasons. Rather than to turn to the press, the fund officials, no doubt seeking to avoid unwanted publicity, preferred to take the case to New Hampshire Attorney General themselves. By the time they approached the Attorney General, they had the videotape and a stack of evidence, and the Attorney General was quickly assigned to the case, and within months, Tynan was indicted on 3 counts of aggravated felonious sexual assault. Good! Finally, something was done. What about Johnson? Was he fired for being inept or investigated? How does Jane feel about that? She says she was happy and satisfied during an interview in the presence of her therapist, Flora Kahlo. Kahlo said that Jane's therapy improved dramatically after the videotaped interview. See, she wanted justice. Kahlo said she told Johnson as much in her letter, and that Jane improved even more after she learned of the arrest. Making the videotape was not easy, Jane said. At first I thought it was embarrassing, but then I said, it's life, you know. It happened. I have to get through it. I have to face it. It happened, so it wasn't so hard to do after a while. Good job, Jane. You're a hero. Jane, now 15, says she never doubted Timon would eventually be arrested. She feels she helped others by her action. Yes, you did. If I would have never told, like many kids would have still been going to Tynan, and the same thing probably would have happened to them. I'm glad it stopped. She also understands her experience helped bring about changes of attitudes and policies at the Fresh Air Fund. I feel good that I'm helping kids, she said. Good job, Jane. Hope you're doing well. A new awareness. Hurd and Gaynor described the changes during the interview. We have to be vigilant, Hurd said. We cannot pretend it doesn't exist because we're wrong in Myrick, the first lawsuit. Forget the fact we had to settle the case. The child was hurt. We didn't believe it could be so. We were too trusting. The changes have included computerizing records, hiring more full-time professionals, training regional representatives more thoroughly, and insisting that chairpersons carefully screen host families. The new attitude has met some resistance, as Chief Mancini predicted it would. We lost some very good people out in the field because they were just not going to do it the new way, Hurd said. There are no illusions that search measures will eliminate all abuse, however. Said Hurd, you can't handle many kids in 13 states in a large camping area and not have incidents of abuse. It's going to happen. We think we got a response mechanism. We think we've begun to learn something about the people who are expert in this area. We think we're operating today in a much more aware environment, a more responsive environment, reactive environment, rather than just saying, no, it couldn't be us, no one would do that to our kids, which, as you know, basically was the response we had 7 years ago, which not on the way there yet, but we're making an effort. Yeah, until the witch hunt narrative came along and destroyed all that. The fund is determined that cases of abuse be handled immediately and professionally, Hurd said. The New York office is now available around the clock for emergencies, and Hurd and Gaynor said personally notified. When circumstances have dictated, fund officials have traveled to a site to ensure a child is safe and that proper authorities are notified. But its involvement does not end there. The New Hampshire experience has taught that the fund must be proactive, not reactive, Gaynor said. The fund now follows up with therapy for a child and family members when necessary. It is no longer assumes that simply notifying the authorities is sufficient. As a fringe benefit of doing the right thing, the fund is much less likely to be sued when it follows such a course of conduct, Gaynor said. Vox and Baraka agreed, as the victim and family are likely to see the fund as a co-victim. Yeah. Fund didn't do anything. Fresh Air Fund didn't do anything. They're just trying to help out. They had places in place. They're the co-victim. Come on now. So long as the fund is acted to be the best of its ability to prevent abuse and help victims in response to it, a suit is unlikely to succeed. Yeah, that's why they changed. The new approach has been proved effective in handling half a dozen emergencies, including sexual abuse in the past couple of years, Hurd said. So it's still going on. He openly and warm credited Vox and Baraka, who had acknowledged sometimes beat us over the head with a stick before they struck a responsive chord. Asked near the end of the interview why institutions commonly deny abuse, Hurd said people have an aversion to the subject and find it easier to say, well, that was their charity, that was New Hampshire, that was that lawsuit. Here we're all friends and neighbors, good Christian people. By God, he warned with the conviction of one who has learned his lesson well, if you don't see that seamy underbelly, there'll be more Tynan cases before there are less. All right, so when I go to the Fresh Air Fund, the reason why I have the Wikipedia website up, I don't see anything about lawsuits and abuse. Do you guys? I mean, let's... Maybe I misread. Maybe I missed something. Let's see here. No? No. Huh. It's like it never happened. Fresh Air Fund, revenue 2018, $15 million, expensive, $18 million. Huh, running it in the red, huh? Let's see here. The Fresh Air Fund abuse. New York Times article in 1981. One thing. Oh, interesting. Oh, that's from the battle on the Backlash. On Vox's website. That's really interesting. Vox posted on his website. Huh. Wonder if I could reach out to Vox and interview him. That's interesting, huh? But as you can see, fresh air abuse, nothing. What about lawsuits? Oh, suit in 2004. Huh. So it was still going on even afterwards. Interesting, in their financial statement, they talk about lawsuits. I saw... Let's see if we can find. There are various lawsuits and threatened actions against the fund arising out of accidents to children and other matters. Yeah, other. Sexual assault is just other. Sexual abuse and sexual assault and pedophilia are just other matters. Some of which claim substantial amounts of damages. In the opinion of the fund's management, these lawsuits are either without merit or are covered by insurance, and will not result in a material adverse effect of the financial position of the charges and the net assets of the fund as of September 30th, 2017. Yeah. Not our fault. They're not without merit. They're not without merit and are covered by insurance. All good. All good. Something tells me that I would not send my children to the Fresh Air Fund. Granted, I don't live in New York, but I probably wouldn't. And I'm probably guessing that these same dirty tricks that were talked about in the battle in the Backlash, of this being a potential ring, a potential nexus, is still going on to this day. That it wasn't just a few bad apples. If anybody wants to take the time to dig in who still owns the Fresh Air Fund, let me see. I'm just curious to see. Let's just type in ownership. Click on Learn About Us and see what they say. Just curious. Oh, that's nice. Tommy Hilfiger giving his generous support to the Fresh Air Fund, and you get Camp Tommy. William Lauder was named chairman of the board. Oh, I wonder if it's part of the board. I'm going to Google that real quick and then we'll be at it for a night. The Blavatnik family. A Warner Musical Group Center. I wonder if that's... Nah. I don't know without looking. Alright. So let's see who's on their board real quick, and that'll be it. I should put board members instead of directors. Meet our team. Board of Directors. Mariah Carey. I don't know any of these other people. It'd be interesting to see who's in their board of directors in the past, though. William P. Lauder. I mean, if you're chairman of the board, you got to be somebody, right? Oh, wow, okay, yeah, my hunch was right. William Philip Lauder, executive chairman of the Estee Lauder Companies. I'm going to have to tell Greg McCarran about this. Huh. They've talked a lot about the Lauders. Yeah. Okay. Yep. My hunch was right. I didn't want to say it. I recognized the name. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I'm gonna have Greg on this week, and I'm gonna ask him about this. I think some things are still going on at the Fresh Air Fund. If you ask John, if anybody else, if you ask me, I'm pretty sure. If you got anybody else recognize any of these names, of course I recognize Mariah Carey. I recognize Louder. I just had to think about it. You know, I didn't want to say it without looking it up. The farther you go down on the list, the more likely a person doesn't know about what goes on at the top. That's what compartmentalization is. But it'd be very interesting to see who've been the board of directors throughout the time and meet our council. Huh? Let's see. Oh, these are just like the kid, like young people helping. Okay. All right, that's it. I'm gonna definitely ask Greg McCarran about William P. Lauder being the chairman of the board of Fresh Air Fund. If you can talk about Lauder and Lauder's family, it'd be very interesting. I might do some follow-up work. Interesting. More quick, let's say previous board of directors of the Fresh Air Fund. Let's see who's at their spring benefit. They're doing a little bit of investigating with me right now just because I'm curious. Hope you guys don't mind. You know what I could do? This is how you usually find out previous board of directors. Take you on a little bit of a... teach you how to sleuth, how to do private investigations. Alright, let's see. Alright, let's go back to 2005. And we'll go to 2010. And that'll be done for today's stream. It was a long stream, wasn't it? Become a host, make a donation, join E-News. Interesting, they don't have nothing about board of director at this time. You'd think they would, you think they'd be like, hey, no, it's just about families and stuff. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Let's try. Let's try 2010. Oh. Oopsie. No, it's not there anymore. Let's try 2013. Learn about us. Nobody I see that's important in this article anyway. History and mission, run our camps. Yeah, so you don't really know who's in the board of directors. They were there hiding it back then. It's interesting. Alright, I might do some more digging in the Fresh Air Fund. I got a lot more stuff to talk about, other things and everything, but I wanted to bring this up as part of the witch hunt narrative or their actual abuse cases. Till next time, everybody, always read the documents. Take care, everyone.